been heavily involved with for a long, long time, and that's the abolition of the death penalty. I'm Dave Bianchi, your worship associate today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Nancy this morning. Now, if you're new to us, know that we're a welcoming community and that we care deeply for all people, regardless of racial identity, age, economic circumstances, immigration status, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Our mission is to grow together in love, faith, justice, and joy. So Mass here at the Fellowship are optional, so we'll respect one another's decisions about face coverings and social distancing. Now, those of you on Zoom will remain muted during the service, but you can put comments in the chat box, and you can stay on and visit with each other after the service ends. So no matter where you are today, sit back, enjoy, and thank you for being with us, and we welcome you once again. And now is an opportunity to take a few minutes and greet one another with a fist or elbow bump, or if you're comfortable, a handshake or a hug, and I'll ring the singing bell when it's time to return to your seat. I open today with the words of David Pohl. We come to this time and this place to rediscover the wondrous gifts of free religious community, to renew our faith in the holiness, goodness, and beauty of life, to reaffirm the way of the open mind and full heart, to rekindle the flame of memory and hope, and to reclaim the vision of an earth made fair with all her people one.
Could you please rise as you're willing and able to sing Spirit of Life?
This is a time of the service when we light the symbol of our faith, the chalice, to bring light onto the many issues that face us. And I've asked Billy Lee Dunford Jackson. It takes longer to say her name than to light the candle.
Good thing I'm cute.
To light this chalice as I say these words. Light this chalice for the inherent worth and dignity of every person and as a symbol of hope for humankind. This is also a time of service where we offer our bounties with each other to continue the positive and far-reaching outreach to our fellowship and the greater community. Baskets will be passed throughout for you who are sitting here, and those on Zoom, of course. And you here, if you like, you can text 73256 by putting UUFNN in a message box and hit send. You can also mail a check to the office at 780 Del Monte Lane, Reno 89511, or better yet, sign up for automatic giving. It's a couple of ways to do that, and contact your office, and Carol will explain the process. It's a simple and convenient way to give. Now, one of the many things I love about this fellowship is that each month we choose a nonprofit to share our plate with. So here's how it works. I already mentioned how to donate by texting. There are instructions to do an additional contribution to our share partner in that process. If you write a check, you can, and you want to make sure it goes to the operating fund, that's where it'll go, unless you make a notation that you want those monies shared with our partners. Our recipient of July is one that Lois and I have been interacting with for many years, the Northern Nevada International Center. This center's main objective is to build bridges of understanding through their educational exchange program, refugee resettlement efforts, and language access resources. So they create opportunities for Nevadans to get involved in global issues. The global refugee crisis is greater now than at any point since World War II. Estimates indicate that in the middle of 2022, more than 103 million people have been forcibly displaced, 37.4 million of which are refugees. fewer than 0.1% of all individuals are being resettled. The center has successfully resettled over 500 displaced persons here in Reno since August of 2016. At least one adult in each family is employed. Now, for many years, our fellowship volunteers have participated in these refugee resettlement programs, providing support and guidance for families who have relocated here seeking peace and opportunities. So our gift can help provide household items and support these families. So thank you for your generosity, and will the ushers please come forward? Would you please join David and me as we bless these offerings to the work of this fellowship, which is helping more people grow in love, faith, justice, and joy. We dedicate ourselves, and these are offerings. Nancy asked me to do a reading by Dorothy Day called Commitment. People say, what is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has the right to sit down and feel hopeless. There's just too much work to do.
But you don't really care for music. hard to follow. Good morning. I'm Nancy Hart, and it's great to be here with you today. Can everyone hear me okay? Coretta Scott King, civil rights leader and wife of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., wrote, "As one whose husband and mother-in-law have died the victims of murder and assassination, I stand firmly and unequivocally opposed to the death penalty for those convicted of capital offenses. An evil deed is not redeemed by an evil deed of retaliation. Justice is never advanced in the taking of a human life. Morality is never upheld by a legalized murder." Some of you know that I have been involved in working to end the death penalty for a long time, almost 40 years. My opposition to the death penalty started long before I became a UU, but once I joined the UU-FNN over 20 years ago, I soon found that my position was completely in line with our UU principles, in particular, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, but also justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. I am one of those Unitarian Universalists who discovered that I was a UU long before I formally became one. You know, the principles and the community of people just fit everything I believed and sought. When I speak about the death penalty, I often like to review some facts about Nevada's death penalty that you may not know. Within the United States, Nevada has the second highest number of people on death row per capita, based on our state population, and the ninth highest number in the country. There are approximately 65 individuals on Nevada's death row. This number fluctuates due to appeals and reversals and deaths by natural causes, but not because of executions. There has been no execution in Nevada in over 15 years, since 2006. The majority of those on our row are from Clark County, but about 10 cases are from Washoe County and a handful from the rural counties. At least a quarter of the people on Nevada's death row have severe mental illness, diagnosed brain damage, or past severe trauma and abuse. Almost 40% of the people on Nevada's row are Black, despite only accounting for 8 to 9% of the total state population. Execution is by lethal injection. We previously used a gas chamber for about 50 years, but in the late 70s we changed to lethal injection. However, due to a lack of available lethal drugs necessary for an execution, it is doubtful that Nevada can carry out an execution, unless the governor decides that it's okay to use expired drugs or experiment with new drugs, which is a possibility. Nevada has executed 12 people since 1977, which is the so-called modern era. There's only one individual that has been executed against their wishes, while 11 were executed when they declined to pursue available appeals. Sometimes we call these men volunteers to die. There have been 4 releases from Nevada's row. These men collectively have spent 95 years in prison under sentence of death for crimes they did not commit. Let's talk about Clark County for a second. From 2010 to 2015, Clark County, which of course is Las Vegas, imposed more death verdicts than all but 2 other counties in the entire United States. This trend has continued. Clark County currently has more than 50 death cases pending at the trial level, one of the highest number of any county in the United States. And in a recent study, 47% of death penalty cases in Clark County were found to have serious prosecutorial misconduct warranting reversal. So I am passionate about working against the death penalty because it is such a grave injustice. Over the years of my commitment to ending the death penalty, I have been inspired by murder victim family members and exonerated death row inmates who share their stories of how they have moved beyond their completely understandable and justifiable anger and grief about the loss of their loved one, about the loss of their life in society, and have arrived at a place of healing and compassion, perhaps even forgiveness. For me, my commitment to ending the death penalty started out as, and still largely is, a human rights issue. As an active member of Amnesty International shortly out of college, I learned about how the death penalty was a violation of fundamental human rights, the right to life and the right to be free from cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishments. These are two provisions from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights signed by all nations in 1948 at the United Nations. These rights are inalienable. Governments cannot take them away, and you don't lose them or forfeit them. I learned that no other Western industrialized nation retains the death penalty. Our neighbors in Canada and Mexico do not have the death penalty, nor do 2/3 of the rest of the world's nations. In contrast, when it comes to executing prisoners, the U.S. shares company with some of the world's worst human rights violators: China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, North Korea, and Iraq. You've probably heard the biblical expression, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But we don't cut off the hands of thieves. We don't assault rapists. We don't put people in stocks. These are things that modern civilized society no longer engages in. All represent progress in recognizing and honoring human rights, yet we still have the death penalty. In addition to learning the human rights violations underpinning the death penalty, I also realized that I believed that it was morally wrong to kill. If it's wrong for murderers to kill, it's no less wrong for me or us to kill them. When the government carries out an execution, it kills in our names. In the words of Sister Helen Prejean, author of Dead Man Walking and a leading voice for death penalty abolition, we can never entrust our governments with the right to think they have the wisdom to be able to decide who should die. On top of human rights concerns and immorality, I believe the United States Supreme Court had it right in 1972 when they ruled the U.S. death penalty unconstitutional, finding that it violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. In Furman versus Georgia, the court found that those who were given the death penalty, a large percentage of whom were Black, were, quote, capriciously selected random handful, quote, of people who had committed murder or rape, and therefore struck it down. 4 years later, in 1976, the Supreme Court reviewed several new state laws and found the death penalty constitutional if certain safeguards were in place. In Gregg versus Georgia, the court established two broad guidelines that state legislatures had to follow in order to craft a constitutional capital scheme. There must be aggravating factors involved, which must be listed in the state's laws, and crucially, the jury must be allowed to take into account mitigating circumstances, the character and record of an individual defendant. This is called the modern era of the death penalty after 1976. Also, there must be a bifurcated proceeding, a guilt phase and then a penalty phase, something that didn't previously happen. This is the death penalty scheme that Nevada and other states with the death penalty have had since the late 1970s. But even though the death penalty is currently considered constitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, and even though these safeguards theoretically ensure that only the worst of the worst killers get the death penalty, when you look at how the death penalty works in practice, it is inconsistent with the values and constitutional protections underpinning our American justice system: due process, fairness, individual rights. If you're not a family member or friend of a murder victim or perpetrator, you may think that the death penalty doesn't affect you. But in the words of Reverend John Marsh, a Unitarian Universalist minister, we are all one human family. We are all going to die someday. And the fact that we are all going to die means that we need to have some solidarity against the death that awaits us all. I have a request that you keep your hearts open to all living human beings, to let no one be alien to your compassion. If we lived only as individuals, or if we believed that those outside of our known community were not fully human, there would be no problem with the death penalty. It is time for us to know that we live not just as individuals, but also as a community. It is time for us to know that our community extends to include all people alive on this earth. That was John Marsh. So in addition to my convictions based on UU principles, international human rights, morals, and the US Constitution, my continuing involvement in Amnesty International and my work within the legal profession has exposed me to the death penalty's many flaws, all of which contribute to making the death penalty arbitrary and unfair. First, and critically, there is the troubling and undeniable racial bias in the use of the death penalty. Really, it is impossible to talk about the death penalty without talking about its connection to lynching and the history of racial terror that this country has endured and that government authorities have endorsed throughout our history. There is an excellent report from the Death Penalty Information Center called Enduring Justice, the Persistence of Racial Discrimination in the U.S. Death Penalty, that details this terrible legacy. And it's more than I can cover in this morning's reflection. But summarizing significantly, after the Civil War, lynching rose in prominence as a method of enforcing social control. Between the 1880s and the 1930s, lynchings were an almost daily occurrence, the vast majority occurring in the South. Across the country, racial violence and lynchings of African Americans spurred Black and white community leaders to create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in 1909. Lynchings continued, however, and a decade later, racial terror occurred at unprecedented levels with the Red Summer of 1919, which targeted African American soldiers returning from World War I, organizing for civil and political rights. There was also the Tulsa Massacre, the razing of Black Wall Street, the deadly Elaine Massacre, and other instances of racial terror. Ultimately, the combination of the extreme racial violence and the increased awareness about and advocacy for civil and political rights culminated in the decline of lynching during the 20th century. In the midst of this gradual movement away from lynching, the death penalty emerged as a legitimate way to kill, silence, terrorize African Americans. Death penalty laws offered due process, but were focused on death in Black individuals. The present-day death penalty can be seen as the pinnacle of the injustice of our American criminal justice system, and its abolition is vital, I believe. But its abolition is part of the larger movement to create a justice system that is equitable and fair, a system that is focused on healing and restoration rather than punishment. Some of you may be familiar with the proposed 8th UU principle, working together to build a diverse, beloved community by working to dismantle racism and other oppressions. While the 8th principle has not yet been adopted by the UUA, we may be hearing and talking more about it as it wins its way to General Assembly. And while the 8th principle is certainly broader than just criminal justice reform, it speaks to me about the recognition of the history of racist oppression involved in both lynching and the death penalty. Here in Nevada, as I mentioned earlier, almost 40% on Nevada's death row are African American, in contrast to 8 or 9% of the state's population. This alarming statistic is only one example of the racial bias experienced by Black and brown Nevadans in our criminal legal system. In the words of Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, quote, "Racial violence has been rationalized, legitimated, and channeled through our criminal justice system. It is expressed as police brutality, solitary confinement, and the discriminatory and arbitrary imposition of the death penalty," unquote. In addition to the clear racial bias in the application of the death penalty, there are many other troubling flaws in how it works in practice. There is rampant prosecutorial misconduct. As earlier mentioned, in Nevada, almost half of death penalty cases in Clark County were found to have prejudicial prosecutorial misconduct, warranting reversal. This means that the district attorney hid evidence from the defense, argued inappropriately, or relied on misinformation, that kind of thing. Around the country, there are significant geographical disparities within states. Local politics and different county prosecutors, plus plea bargaining and pure chance, make it a lottery of who lives and dies because individual county DAs have enormous discretion in who they decide to seek a death penalty for. And as mentioned, Clark County files a disproportionate number of cases in Nevada and is, in fact, one of the top counties in the country seeking the death penalty. Brian Stevenson, and I'm quoting several people here because when I do this work, I realize how many amazing people also have been concerned about this. But Brian Stevenson is the author of Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, which is also a movie, and he's the founder of Equal Justice Initiative. Quote, "The reality is that capital punishment in America is a lottery. It is a punishment that is shaped by the constraints of poverty, race, geography, and local politics. The death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for the crimes they commit. The real question of capital punishment in this country is, do we deserve to kill?" Then there is geographic bias within the United States. The death penalty is overwhelmingly concentrated in the South, with 82% of all executions since 1976 having taken place there, also illustrating the continuing legacy of racial injustice that I discussed earlier. Then there is a shocking number of cases involving innocents. Since 1973, 192 people who were wrongly convicted and sentenced to death have been exonerated, released from death rows in the United States based on their innocence. Some of these individuals have actually been executed. In Nevada, we've had 3 people released from death row based on not being guilty of the crimes for which they received a death sentence. And then last, the disturbing prevalence of serious mental illness and abuse and neglect in our death row inmates is another serious flaw. All of these troubling issues could be further unpacked, but I wanted to highlight racial bias in particular and mention briefly the others to say that learning about them, I came to understand that the death penalty was a human rights violation and grossly unfair. So even if I believed that murderers deserved to die for their crimes, the death penalty would still conflict with my sense of justice and my belief in human rights. Of course, our UU principles and fundamental human rights also apply to victims of violence and their loved ones and family members. They too are entitled to dignity and to justice, and I hope nothing I've said suggests that murderers are more deserving of dignity and justice or have more rights than their victims or victims' family members. More than anything, I believe that victims of violence and victims' family members need healing, and we should all do what we can to promote that healing. In my experience, the American criminal justice system fails most victim family members when it comes to real healing. I have seen healing, however, in victims' family members who oppose the death penalty, who have managed to move beyond rage and feelings of revenge and reached a place of peace, if not forgiveness. I've seen it in exonerated death row inmates who speak out against the death penalty, who have moved beyond their justifiable anger at a system that wrongly convicted them. These are incredibly inspiring people who have been directly impacted by the death penalty and understand its false promises and terrible mistakes. You can see and hear the transformation that they've gone through. They understand that healing is a process, not an event. They know that forgiveness is not a feeling, but an act of will. It is difficult work, no question, but it shows all of us, that such transformation is possible. In fact, the voices of murder victim family members and exonerated individuals have been absolutely central to the progress made in the past decade in the national movement to abolish the death penalty. Some argue that the death penalty is necessary to deter violent crime and that we shouldn't be wasting taxes on keeping horrible criminals alive and should just take them out. However, criminologists and studies have overwhelmingly concluded that there is no evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent. and maintaining it is actually considerably more expensive than life in prison without parole. A sentence that is not only severe, but one that also permits the possibility of a redemption. We know that we have a long way to go to educate Nevada citizens about the realities of maintaining the death penalty, but I am optimistic that abolition is on the horizon. We got close in the 2021 legislative session, and we are working to build momentum and support for repeal. I like to remember the words of Sister Helen Prejean, quote, "For most people, the death penalty is an issue that's just out there, and they don't reflect on it very deeply. They hear about a terrible crime and say, that person deserves to be executed. But I know if we could bring people close and educate them, we'd shut the death penalty down," unquote. In the US, there are 27 states that have the death penalty, including Nevada. Currently, over 2,400 people await execution in the United States. And since 1976, the so-called modern era, over 1,500 people have been executed. However, just 15 years ago, there were 38 states with the death penalty. But since 2007, 11 states have ended their death penalty, including Virginia most recently in 2021. Internationally, 144 countries, 70% of the world's nations, have ended the death penalty in law or practice. 57% of countries, 112 countries, have actually abolished the death penalty on their books as well as in practice. And most recently, Ghana, Zambia, Equatorial Guinea, Papua New Guinea, the Central African Republic, Sierra Leone, and Kazakhstan just in the past 2 years. With the national and international trend toward abolition, I believe we'll see it in Nevada in my lifetime. I certainly hope so. Thank you for letting me share my thoughts about this issue that is so compelling to me. May it be so.
Please rise as you're willing and able to sing "Wake Now My Senses."
Giving
This is our special time when we can reflect on our own joys and sorrows. Those on Zoom can put those in the chat box or simply hold thoughts in your heart. Those of us here can stop, put your feet down on the floor, take a breath, breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. As Nancy mentioned, let's remember those who have been put to death by this state. Let's hold in our hearts all the victims of our wasted sense of justice. And now, let's take this time to reflect. And let's send our thoughts and prayers to Nathan as he mourns the loss of his grandfather this week. As is our custom, put one hand on our heart and raise the other to demonstrate our openness to mercy and justice. Amen. Well, thank you for joining us today, and watch your email for announcements and upcoming events, of which we always have plenty. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list, please contact the office and watch for announcements like the renal posse and their needs to help feed our neighbors without homes. Next week, remember, we're going to be sharing books, much like the flower communion. So please bring a book to share and take one with you to read. It should be a lot of fun. And Jackie Riley, president of our board, has some announcements.
Good morning. Good to see everyone here and on Zoom. Just wanted to let you know the board is working hard, doing lots of things, and we're most importantly right now looking forward to welcoming Reverend Shelley in 2 weeks. Yes, she'll be here on the 13th. We have teams working on a variety of projects and tasks. Safety and Security Task Force will be formed. Chris Picars is going to be heading that up. Now that we're back in the building, we have to kind of remember a lot of things that we didn't do for a couple of years. We have a Building Use Task Force that is headed by Chris Hyland, and they're looking at increasing use of the building through rentals. We will be forming a transition team along with Reverend Shelley that will help us make the transition from Reverend Foster's retirement to a settled minister in a couple of years. We also are forming, and I'm here to ask if there's any volunteers. We are going to form a capital campaign for our HVAC system. You may remember hearing about our HVAC system needs. We estimate quite a large call for that. If there's anybody interested in being on that committee, on that team, just let me know. You can also, whether you're on Zoom or here in person, send an email to president@uufnn.org. Or if you have any questions, you can do that. Nancy, thanks for bringing up, what is it, Principle 8? Actually, that was voted on, part of it, at GA in June, and it'll be voted on again next June at GA, and it's been reformatted into Article 2. So I invite you to take a look at the UUA. There's been a large group of folks working on it for 3 years. There were 86 amendments proposed. Never a lack of an opinion or an idea when you've got a group of UUs together, right? 15 of those were addressed during GA, General Assembly. For those of you that don't know what that means, that's when all UUs around the world get together for a week of wonderful workshops, meetings, and sessions. It'll be voted on again next June. So do some reading up on that. I think the changes they've made are good. One of them actually addresses racism in our principle of the inherent, I can't even say it, worth. I don't want to say it because worth has a particular connotation if you're a black person, because you weren't quite worth what anybody else was. So I struggle saying it now that I'm aware of that. I think maybe worthiness and dignity. Anyway, that verbiage is changing in Article 2. So watch for that. Nancy Jones will have next Sunday some more of the pride stoles that JJ gave out a while back. She's been making some. She'll bring them next Sunday. And last but not least, there are a ton, maybe not quite a ton, but a number of plums on the table out there that my neighbor and I picked from his tree last night. That's not even half of them. Please take as many as you want, and what's left we'll give to the posse. So have a good day. Thanks.
Well, please stand as you're willing and able as we closing song, Fire of Commitment, and then stay standing for the benedictions. with the words of Mahatma Gandhi, a principle is a principle, and in no case can it be watered down because of our incapacity to live it in practice. We have to strive to achieve it, and the striving should be conscious, deliberate, and hard. Amen. So may it be, and namaste.